This is video lecture number 2. The first lecture was entirely introductory. This lecture is much more substantive. And again, not only the student travelers, but we're asking and actually requiring that all of the travelers, student and non-student, watch these videos. And the idea is to get our travelers as up to speed, as well prepared as possible for the trip. The trip is just going to be so much more productive and fruitful if, in fact, as many of these concepts, which are so central to what we're trying to get across there in Israel, if you're already familiar with them. So this is an important lecture. I call it, as you see here, The Nation of Israel and the Purposes of God. And again, this is a lecture that I use in various classes. It may not be new to you, but I'm going to ask you, even though it may be redundant as to content and even maybe the lecture itself, I'm going to go rather quickly, but I'm going to ask you to pay careful attention and to get these concepts. They really are pivotal to what we're doing. Now, I like to say that this lecture was born in large part of the persuasion on my part that there is a tremendous culture and theological shock that you encounter when you open the page of the Old Testament. And so much of what we're going to be doing in Israel, and so much of what I'm desperate for you to take home with you when you leave Israel, has to do with what God is doing in the Old Testament. And it's not immediately intuitive. It's all over the pages of Scripture. There's nothing particularly debatable or controversial or even dubious about anything that we're going to say here. But it's a set of ideas designed to bring us rather face to face with the distinctive purposes of God in the Old Testament. And I say that it's 7 concepts basic to an understanding of what God intended to accomplish. First of all, 4, because clearly that's central. He's going to make a covenant with Israel and promise to do remarkable goodness to them, for them, but also not only what God is intending to do for Israel, but just as importantly, through Israel. Because that's the real nub of what we're talking about here. And, well, let me get to it. I give you 7 concepts. And the first concept is what I call the intent and importance of Israel's influence. And that word influence is the big word, because the point is God intended to use Israel. He raised up Israel in order to make himself known to the world. Now, to that end, let me just develop it very quickly. The concept is simply this, that God chose Israel to be salt and light in the midst of a wicked world. Now, that concept of salt and light comes from, perhaps most directly, from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and we usually hear it applied to either churches or the church or believers today. That's not what Jesus has in mind. He is speaking specifically of Israel, and I think he is crystallizing, distilling the purpose of God marvelously there when he talks about how Israel was chosen to be salt and then light to a wicked world. And notice I make the point here, to a wicked world. That's the point of Genesis 1 to 11. Let me just make this point, and it really is telling. It is interesting that God's call of Abraham comes really very late in Old Testament history. Now, we don't think of it that way because it happens in Genesis chapter 12. So you've got 11 chapters, and then in chapter 12, God calls Abram from Ur of the Chaldees and makes a covenant with him. But in point of fact, that is well into Old Testament history. Let me do just a little bit of arithmetic, and if this is brand new to you, you really need to get your arms around this. I know for most of the students, you'll be familiar with this, but God calls Abram in Genesis chapter 12. Now, a rough chronological identification of that is about 2100 BC. Genesis 12 happens about 2100 BC. Now, I'm not going to take you through all of this, but suffice it to say that specifically, Abraham was born in 2166 BC. We arrive at that by starting at 1 Kings 6, which says that that Solomon began to build his temple, the temple, in his fourth year. We know that his fourth year was 966 BC. That's calculated by some very important cross references to be found in the Assyrian eponym list and so on, but nobody denies that. So now the verse goes on to say, I'm talking about 1 Kings 6:1, says that Solomon began to build the temple in his fourth year, 966 BC, which was 480 years after Israel came out of Egypt. So if you simply add the 966 and the 480, you come up with 1446 as the date of the Exodus. And we know that Jacob, when he went, that was the year in which he went down. We know that they were there for 430 years. So you add the 430 years of the sojourn. That's how long they were actually in Egypt. And you come up with 1876. I can't write very well with this pen. 1876 is the year they went down. Now we know that Jacob, when he went down, was 130 years old. So we can add the 130 and it gets us to the year of Jacob's birth. 130 years, that would be 2006. And we know that Jacob's father, Isaac, was 60 years old when he bore Jacob. So we can add 60 and get back to the year of Isaac's birth, which is 2066. 2006 is the year of Jacob's birth. And 2066 is the year Isaac was born. And of course, one of the best known chronological data points of the Old Testament is that Abraham was 100 when he bore Isaac, and so that would be 2166. Now that's how we get to 2166 as the birth of Abraham or Abram. And again, there's nothing there but, I always say, hard data and simple arithmetic. You have those figures that are in the scriptures. Now, on the other hand, if Abram was born in 2166, the Bible says that he was 75 when he was in fact called out of Ur of the Chaldees. Genesis 12 happened when he was 75. So now you got to subtract the 75 and you come up with 2091. So I'm saying 2091 is Genesis. No, I'm not saying. This is the calculations are quite explicit and simple. So Genesis 12 happens in 2091. Well, that means, let's say for round number, now here's the point I was after with all of this. Let's say for round number, I'm going to get rid of all this, that Abram was born. The hard number is 2091, so let's round it off to 2100, make our arithmetic easy. Now, if Abram was born in 2100 BC, and the earliest possible, I'm not going to get into this, it has to do with how to understand the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, but the most recent, did I say earliest, the most recent possible date for creation, and it's one I hold, I'm a young earth freak, but the least, the most recent would be about 4000 BC. So there was about 1900 years by the most conservative calculations between creation, this is Genesis 1, and Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. So 1900 years. Now think about this. From Abraham, Genesis 12, to Malachi, Nehemiah, the last book, the last events of the Old Testament, when did that happen? Well, around 400. So the point is, if in fact from Genesis 1 to Genesis 12 is about 1900 years, and that takes us, and from Genesis 12 to Malachi, which is about 400, is about 1700 years. So what's that mean? Again, that's Genesis 12. Can you read this all the way through Malachi, the Old Testament, the end of the Old Testament? The point is that there is more human history in Genesis 1 to 11 than there is in the rest of the Old Testament. So there's a lot of history. That's the point. And I say all that just to make to drive home this reality. And this is, I think there's little doubt that this is exactly what God wants us to take from this, that you have some almost 2 millennia of human history in Genesis 1 to 11. Now the story is creation, fall, flood, Babel, those primary events. But it's a lot of human history in a small space. And if there's anything that is absolutely characteristic of that permeates those chapters, Genesis 1 to 11. It is rebellion, disobedience, apostasy, the most incorrigible hardness on the part of and that's the point. For those 2,000 years, Genesis 1 to 11, briefly told, hugely important. For those almost 2,000 years, the human race just proved itself so stubborn. Now, in Genesis 12, and this is huge, in Genesis chapter 12, God turns a huge corner. And oftentimes, by the way, Genesis 1 to 11, I give you this elsewhere, but Genesis 1 to 11 is sometimes called universal dealings. That's just a title, which is often in Bible survey books and so on assigned Genesis 1 to 11. Why? Because here he is dealing with the race as a race. What happens in Genesis 12? God focuses on one man, makes a covenant with him, promises he's going to make of him a family, and out of that family is going to come a clan, and out of that clan is going to come a tribe, as it were, and out of that's going to come a nation, and God is going to bless that nation. He's going to have a relationship with that nation that he never has with other people. So it is hugely significant that in Genesis 12, God turns this huge corner, calls Abraham to himself. Now, I say that to make this rather skinny little point, and that is that it is altogether too easy, I am convinced, to come to the horribly mistaken and probably witless conclusion or idea that in Genesis 12, God chooses Abraham because the nations of the world, having proven themselves so recalcitrant, so stubborn, God decides he will work with this one nation, this one family, and see if he can get them to follow him and just leave the rest of the world to go its own way. Now, when I say it that way, you know it's absolutely wrong, and nobody would embrace that, although it creeps into our thinking altogether too easily. But my point is that in choosing, and that's the point, in choosing Israel, in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham, who's going to become the nation of Israel. In choosing Abraham and the nation to follow, to come from his loins, in choosing Abraham, God is not rejecting the world. The world has rejected him, but he is not abandoning the world. He's not neglecting the world. He is not choosing Israel or Abraham at the expense of or to the neglect of the world. He is choosing Abraham and his descendants as the primary strategy which he, God, Yahweh, will use to put himself on display to the world and draw the world to himself. So that's the point. God chose Israel. I'm focusing on the importance of Israel's influence. God chose Israel to be salt and light in the midst of a wicked world. And that point is made in these two verses. Now, I want to stop on these two verses very quickly, but there are these two hugely important passages, and they represent very, very significant and basic seminal turning points in the outworking of God's purposes. First of all, Genesis 12:3. Now, let me make this point. To this day, Israel perceives of itself as having two fathers. First of all, Abraham is the father of the family. Think of it that way. Moses, Mount Sinai, Exodus 19, is the father of the nation. Israel, throughout the book of Genesis, is a family. It's not a huge family, but it's growing. They go down into Egypt, they grow large, they come out, they go to Mount Sinai, God offers them a covenant by which he will become their king. The family of Abraham becomes the nation of Israel. That's what's happening at Mount Sinai. Now, the point is that these two passages, Genesis chapter 12 and then Exodus chapter 19, are the defining points. In Genesis chapter 12, God calls Abram and promises to make him a family. In so doing, you'll recall this perhaps, he says, all the earth is mine, you shall be a blessing to all nations. So in calling Abram, he doesn't say, I'm sick of the other nations, I'm going to work with you and they can go their own way. He says, I'm calling you in order that you might be a blessing to all the nations. So in calling the family of Israel to himself, he makes it explicit that he is doing so in order they might be a blessing to all the nations. And then, just as importantly, in Exodus 19:5 and 6, and now we are at the foot of Mount Sinai, the nation of Israel. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say it that way. The family of Abraham, having grown to millions, has been brought out by miracle under the hand of Moses, and they are now at Mount Sinai. They are offered this marvelous covenant. We call it the Old Covenant, the law, by which the family of Abraham will become the nation of Israel. And in so offering that, God says to them, Exodus 19, verse 6, and it's unspeakably important, this verse, he says that if you'll obey me, then he uses two descriptive phrases, and I want you to hear these. They really, look, there is no verse in the Old Testament, I think, which is any more descriptive and definitional to the purposes of God in his dealings with mankind than these two verses. Actually, two verses, but then in verse 6, God says, if you obey me, I will be your king and you shall be my people. And then he says this, I will make of you, first of all, a kingdom of priests. Now remember that, a kingdom of priests. What does he mean by that? Does he mean that you'll be a kingdom in which everybody can be a priest? Of course not. We know that. There was one tribe that was the Levi, the Levitical tribe, out of that one house, the house of Aaron, that could be priests. No, that's not what he means. He means, I will make you, and this is such a descriptive phrase. You need to understand it. I will make you a kingdom with a priestly function. What does a priest do? He mediates. So here's God, here's the world. How is it that God is going to mediate the truth concerning himself to the world? The answer is Israel. I will make you a kingdom, a nation of people, and you will have a priestly function. I will put myself on display to the world through you. So on the one hand, they're going to be a kingdom of priests. But secondly, he says, and this is just as I will make you a holy nation. Now, what is holy? It means set apart. I will make you a distinct, set apart nation. I will set you apart geographically, culturally, theologically, historically. Everything about who you are as a people will be remarkably and unmistakably and instructively distinct from the other nations of the world. So the point is, in order for God to use Israel to influence, to draw the world to himself, in order to use God as that salt and light, he was going to make of them, first of all, a kingdom with a priestly function, and secondly, a holy nation. But the point to be made here is that in all of that, especially here in Exodus 19:5 and 6, God is making or let's say it this way, and I'll go to the next slide, that in choosing Israel, God was not neglecting or rejecting the rest of the peoples of the world. All right, so I'm going to leave it there. I'm telling you, both in the, listen, let me just say, it is so common for the world to resent the fact that Israel is the one people of God. Who do you think you are? What right do you have to think that you alone? Listen, it's not that God only loves Israel. It's not that God chose Israel because she was in some sense deserving or worthy of it. She has spent her history, and this is important to the purpose of God, proving that she wasn't worthy of it, just as we're not worthy of God's love. But the point is, it is so easy, and sometimes it slips into the minds of some Jewish people. We must be special. We're the ones whom God chose. Well, it's true. And there is a sense in which they are special, but he chose them not as an end in itself, not because he wanted to just deal with them and neglect the rest of the world. He chose them as a kingdom. So you're going to be a kingdom with a priestly function. One of the dynamics that is inherent in that phrase, I will make of you a kingdom of priests, and which is as counterintuitive as almost any theological idea that we can come across to people today, is this idea that it was the nation, the ethnos, the people, the kingdom of Israel, whom God had chosen and has chosen to use as the vehicle by which he would put himself on display. And God's capacity to do that, to use Israel to that end, is not in any meaningful sense associated with the question of how many individual Israelites are actually believers. Frankly, at any given time, there was just a remnant of believers. Most of the nation of Israel throughout the Old Testament, good heavens, the nation that left Egypt, believed not, the Bible says in Jude. He slew them because they didn't believe. They were unbelievers, and it's demonstrated in everything they do. So the point is, because we think we tend to extrapolate our idea of what God is doing today in the local church and so on back there. And of course, today, God works through believers, and it's important to work to make sure that a church is composed of those who are twice born and so on. In Israel, at any given time, most of the individual Israelites living in the covenant community were not rightly related to Yahweh in an eternal sense. But God used that nation as a nation, irrespective of how many individuals were genuine believers. It was God's dealing with the nation as a nation in the midst of all the other nations. The way he blessed their obedience and cursed their disobedience, and the way he shaped, that's what God used to put himself on display. So I spend too much time. The intent and importance of Israel's influence is that Israel would be a light to the nations. All right, a second concept, and that is the principle of providential placement. And I'm speaking specifically of the land of Israel, the actual physical, Eretz Israel, the physical land which God promised to them. And the point is, it's significant the way it was placed on the earth, the shape of the earth, the arrangements of the continents and the seas as the floodwaters receded and so on. None of that's accidental. In God's perfect, careful providence as he planted Israel at a hugely strategic place. Now, to get this across, I can be rather quick, but the concept is simply this, that God placed Israel at the most strategic spot on the most important international highway in the ancient world, which was called, after Breasted of University of Chicago, the Fertile Crescent. Now, the Fertile Crescent is described as a sickle of land. You see the sickle shape here, which stretches from Egypt on the south and west to Mesopotamia on the east. So you have Egypt here, and you have Mesopotamia here. Now, it's fair to say that the cultures that developed very, very early on after the flood, and I always say, when you think of cultures developing, you think of some hairy guy crawling out of a cave, knocking a couple of rocks together, trying to get fire. That's not what we're talking. We're talking about very intelligent culture, well-bred people, actually four with Noah, of course, and then his three sons and their wives, getting off the ark, finding an ecology very different from what they had known, and with the stewardship, the specific mandate by God to establish cultures. And as they begin to establish those cultures, these are the areas: Egypt on the west and south, if you don't mind, Mesopotamia on the east. In both cases, might I say, it's because of these rivers, the Nile River here and the Tigris-Euphrates here. And as a result of that, cultures developed: irrigation, easy travel, trade, middle class, all that sort of thing. And so cultures tend to develop in these areas. Now, the point to be made here is that the highway that stretched from Egypt on the west and south, the Mesopotamia in the east, it's called the Fertile Crescent. Here is perhaps a better map. It is defined, the Fertile Crescent is defined as a sickle of land which stretches from Egypt to Mesopotamia, which can be, watch this, traveled, settled, and cultivated. And here's the big issue. So it can be traveled. There is a highway that passes this way. There's plenty of water and so on. It can be settled. You can settle in and cultivate, grow land. So it's a sickle of land which can be traveled, settled, and cultivated. And here's the issue, though, but which is surrounded on all sides by terrain where none of that is possible. What makes the Fertile Crescent so important, here is the Fertile Crescent, is number one, the Arabian Desert that thrusts up into its underbelly, and then these huge Caucasus Mountains and so on to the north. So again, given the desert to the south and the mountains to the north and west, and then of course the Mediterranean Sea here to the west, the mountains to the east, I should say. But the point is, given all of that, traffic is, and again, if it's you and your buddy, maybe you can make it across the Arabian desert. But if you're moving an army or a caravan, you're going to follow the crescent. Now, that's a given. It's hugely important. It's not accidental. It's the way God shaped the earth. But here is what is really important. That is that, I tell people that there is one little tiny factoid, one little tiny geographical data point that I can tell you that eclipses everything else as far as geography and so on, if you want to understand why Israel is so important, or more importantly, for our purposes here, if you want to understand what it is that God is doing, what his strategy is in the Old Testament. And here is that little tiny narrow point of, that fact point, and that is that Israel is the narrowest spot on the Fertile Crescent. Yea, verily, it is the only truly narrow spot where all traffic is going to be funneled into one area, and it's going to be Israel. And I say here, this is what makes Israel so strategic. And again, this is so fascinating. Israel, it's no accident, folks. And it's interesting to actually trace the way in different ages, different epochs, different stages of history, to trace the way in which God has contrived very carefully, providentially, to make Israel the center of the universe, as it were. It is today, for heaven's sakes. But I leave that. In antiquity, in spite of the fact that Israel was so small, so tiny, we'll talk more about it, in spite of the fact that she had very little natural resources, the water was always a problem, plenty of water, but how to catch it, how to store it, how to use it, and so on. In spite of the fact that there was so relatively little tillable soil, in spite of the fact that they have no natural defenses as a land, the land is so accessible and easy to invade, and so on. In spite of all of those negative elements of the land, it was always the most, that's what it says, it was always so strategic. And any nation which wanted to control the Mediterranean world, the Eastern Mediterranean world to any degree, had to control this little tiny land. Now, let me go a little further here. This map focuses on the real choke point. And this is huge. We're going to spend our first day in Israel this coming December, focusing on this valley, this all-important valley. It's a little tiny valley. Well, it's not teeny, but it's here. My white ink doesn't show up so well. It's an arrowhead-shaped valley, and it's called the Jezreel. And it has a shaft to the arrow right here called the Harod. Again, that's the Jezreel Valley. And here, the shaft to the arrow is called the Harod Valley. And the point is that this is the most important valley on the face of the earth. The Jezreel is. Over 40 history-shaping battles have been fought in this valley. Why? Because, again, let me give you the international traffic. Here is the basic... it's not responding here. I'm going the wrong way. Here are the basic highways. Now watch. There are two highways at stake here. This one to the east is called the King's Highway. It's not nearly as important. It is important, but by the time we get into even, it's important in patriarchal history, Genesis, Abraham, and so on. Much less important during the days of the conquest and the possession and the monarchy and so on. It is important. On the other hand, this highway right here is the Fertile Crescent. Well, it's all part of the Fertile Crescent. This highway is generally called the Via Maris. Now, to be honest with you, there is some dispute as whether the Via Maris is all of this traffic all the way up here, or if it's simply the part that goes along the sea, because Via Maris means the way of the sea. But regardless, there is an eastern trunk, and that's the King's Highway over here. But then there is also this more important and much more pleasant and much safer western trunk, which is the Via Maris. Now, here's the point. And this is, I'm going back to it, folks. A little boring geography maybe, but you got to know this. What makes this valley so important is the way God shaped the world. You've got the desert over here. You've got this horrible Jordan Rift. You don't want to go down there. You don't want to take your army or caravan down there. You're exposed. There's no water. It's very, very difficult and so on. You got to climb back out. So, And remember now, way over here is Mesopotamia. Up here, up off the map a little bit, is Damascus. So I didn't mean to do that. I'm making a mess here. So the point is that you're coming now. Here comes a caravan. They've left Mesopotamia. They've traveled for weeks over the Fertile Crescent. Now they're going to come down to Damascus. They're off to Egypt. That's where they're headed, down here. Well, here they come. The traffic is going to come down here, and it's going to, there are a couple of choices. Here's the little pear-shaped Sea of Galilee in the north of Israel. They can come north of the Sea of Galilee, down through the Harod, and up to Bethsaida and Capernaum, and down to the Horns of Hattim and Mount Tabor. We'll talk about this, but they're going to be channeled into this valley. On the other hand, you could come south, around the south of the Sea of Galilee, ford the Jordan River, well north, and then go up the Harod Valley and make your way into the Jezreel. But the fact is that the traffic is going to be funneled into this little tiny valley right here. Once it is, now here's another very important little factoid. I shouldn't say it's not all important, but it's very helpful. Most of the mountains and the hill country and so on are on a pretty much a north-south orientation. There is this exception, this hill right here. It's called Mount Carmel. It's not showing up real well, but this hill right here, Mount Carmel, lies on a kind of a northwest to southeast. The point is that mountain, Mount Carmel, 1 Kings 18, will stand there, we'll look down into this valley. That mountain is a roadblock, a limestone hard roadblock across the traffic. And in point of fact, once you are funneled, I'm thinking coming from the north here, once you are funneled into this valley, there are 3 passes that get you out. There is here the Yokneam Pass, Joknam. This central pass, most important, you've heard of it, is called the Megiddo Pass. And this more southern eastern pass is called the Dothan. It's supposed to be a Ibleam Pass. Now, you don't have to remember all that now. You should know it, but here's the big issue. All of that traffic, caravan and military, that was forced into that Jezreel Valley from the north, funneled in. It's just all the geography funnels you into that valley. They're trying to get down here to the Via Maris and off to Egypt. But in order to get there, they have to go through one of those 3 passes. What does that mean? If you can control those passes, you can control and monitor and perhaps most importantly, tax all of that traffic. That Jezreel Valley, the reason it's so often a spot of international battles of historical significance is for that reason right there. That if you can control that area, that valley, control those 3 passes, you can control military and commercial traffic throughout much of the ancient world. So I'm going to leave it there while I say here that this is the great bottleneck and do a little primitive animations here. But this valley right here, where all that traffic is going to be funneled, is in fact the great international traffic, the bottleneck on the international highway. And this is what made it necessary for any nation which would dominate the Mediterranean world to conquer and possess Israel. So, what's that got to do with us? Well, the fact is that I started out by saying that, remember, the first principle is the principle of the intent and importance of Israel's influence, that God chose Israel with the specific intent that they would be salt and light to the world. But how was he going to accomplish that? Well, and I say here, God was not neglecting or rejecting the rest of the peoples of the world. But you need to understand this, and this is so important. In antiquity, people all over the world were hugely fascinated and interested in whatever was happening all over the rest of the world. So they wanted to hear about it. But how was news carried? You don't have to go very far back from our day to get to that day when you couldn't get a message from here to there any faster than you get a person from here to there. Somebody had to carry the message. How was it done in antiquity? The answer, quite simply, is heralds who would learn of some important historical event. He might sit on a hillside and watch a battle and write out the report for himself. He might go and witness a grand marriage somewhere. He might watch the coronation of a prince who'd become king. He might hear about a coup and go and interview people and find out what was going on. He might hear about some grand invention and go and see that and draw pictures. But how then he would carry that, and everywhere he would go, he would be welcomed and feted. People wanted to hear. He'd be given the best room and the best house and so on. But how did he get from place to place? Inevitably, invariably, he would attach himself to a caravan. It wasn't safe to travel in the ancient world all by yourself. The caravans had small armies. They had security setups and so on. So you'd pay, as if you don't mind, the wagon master a bit of a fee, and you would travel a little ways, and then you would come to some city, and everybody would want to hear what you had to say. Then you'd catch another caravan. Now, do you see where I'm taking you? Those caravans were remarkably, again and again, to a great, there's no way to recover the exact proportion, but the predominant percentage of those caravans were funneled into Israel. And as they passed little Israel, they heard the stories of what this Yahweh God was able to do. You know, God often defines himself or identifies himself. One of the descriptors he uses of himself again and again in the Old Testament, he is the living God. What does it mean? He's the living God. He can do things as opposed to a face carved in a piece of wood or in a rock. They couldn't do anything. Yahweh is a real God. And he intervened again and again in the most dramatic ways in his people. And those stories, here come these caravans. They're going to hear those stories. And they are going to carry those stories to the end of the earth. So what I'm saying to you is, here it is, the significance on the screen. God, in choosing Israel, God was not neglecting or rejecting the rest of the people, the rest of the peoples of the world. But this is what you have to understand. In fact, God did not send Israel to the world. He brought the world to Israel. Frankly, Israel did not have. I know it's quite the passion today. Everybody wants to go to Jonah and build a case for a mission mandate in the Old Testament. It's not there. They weren't starting up mission agencies and sending people out to tell people about Yahweh. God's going to use the diaspora to do that later on. But the fact of the matter is that Israel's mandate was to stay in the land. And God, and I'm back to it, it's Israel as a nation. And as those people stayed in that land, and God blessed their obedience and cursed their disobedience, and was more nigh to them than any other God could ever be to another people, those stories were carried to the ends of the earth. And we know beyond any shadow of a doubt that they were. So I go back to it. Here's the strategy. As a matter of fact, the first two concepts. Number one, God's intent was always that Israel would be salt and light, that they would, as a people, they would influence the world. To that end, he providentially shaped the face of the earth so that little tiny inconsequential Israel sat right at the crossroads, and the traffic of the world is going to be funneled in there, and the stories of God's marvelous intervention on the part of his people were going to be heard. All right, now I got to be quick. My third point is the dynamics of distinctive divisions. Now, let me just say that I would argue that this second point, that Israel was a kingdom with a priestly function, is primarily a factor of providential placement. That is by reason of the way God shaped the earth, that the stories of how he dealt with Israel would be carried to the ends of the earth, and therefore they would become a kingdom who would mediate the truth of God to the world. On the other hand, concept number 3 is the primary issue with regard to the second of those two phrases in Exodus 19:6, and that is that they are going to be a holy, a set-apart nation, because one of the most remarkable dynamics that everybody acknowledges and really kind of staggers at when you study Israel carefully is that this reality that it is at once so small, and yet it is composed of such remarkably distinctive geographical, topographical, climatological, agricultural, cultural divisions. Now, let me make that point quickly. the concept is simply this, and I said it, the land of Israel, the very small, is marked by 5. I'm going to count 5. Sometimes they're different. And here they are. First of all, there is I'll give them to you. From west to east, from the Mediterranean in, there is the coastal plains, and they just are what you would expect. And then there is an area that we're going to spend a lot of time with while we're in Israel. We'll spend a half a day there. Hugely important, not usually paid as much attention to, but this area to the south called the Shpela, the lowlands. It's just a series of lower undulating hills that lies between Judea to the south here and the Mediterranean and the coastal plains. And then, of course, there is this central hill country. It's very important. It's a kind of a spine running north and south, very steep, V-shaped valleys, rugged hills. Water runs off very quickly. Very, very difficult living, to be honest with you. Then beyond that is what is undoubtedly, in my mind anyway, who am I to say, but the most remarkable geographical phenomenon in the not geographic, well, it is that, but more importantly, geological phenomenon on the face of the earth, which is the Jordan Rift, better known as not better known, but more properly the Syro-African Rift, but runs from Syria all the way to Central Africa. But in Israel, it's just this hugely deep cleft of the earth, which the traffic stays away from there. So it funnels all of the traffic to the west of it, and thus down through the Jezreel Valley and the Via Maris. And then there is the Transjordan Plateau as it rises up and off to the Arabian Desert. We'll not spend a lot of time with that. Now look, here it is again, and I rather overdo it, but I've tried to draw it in here. Here are the coastal plains, and it is good to mention perhaps that this Jezreel Valley right here, which seems distinct, is actually part of the coastal plains. It's just an extension, but here is that Mount Carmel that we talked about before, that thumb sort of sticking off toward the northwest. That is because here are these 3 passes between the 2. All right, so you have the coastal plains, and then you have the Shpela. I may have positioned it just a little bit north here. You need to know these well. We're going to spend a lot of time with them. And then the hill country in yellow here, and the hills to the north in the Galilee are not as rugged as the hills to the south. This right here is the Harod Valley, that shaft of the arrow that we talked about before. But the hill country it's difficult, and it's inaccessible, and it's hard to travel and hard to farm, but it is hugely important, not only to the history and the stories we have in the Old Testament that happened there, but to what God is doing in this land. And then you have this Jordan Rift from the Sea of Galilee up here in the north down to the Dead Sea, stretches further south, way further south and further north, and then the Transjordanian Plateau. Now let me go quickly here because I've used up too much time, but I'm going to go through each of these, and very quickly we're going to, and then I'll give you my point here quickly. The coastal plains, just that, the sand dunes, the rolling sand dunes, quite flat, and so on. Again, I gave them to you there. Here are some pictures. This is looking across the Philistine plains. This is part of the agriculture and so on, up north toward Mount Carmel. This is even further north. This is the plain of Dor. This is the coastal plains. Now I'm going to say, and we'll make much of this when we are there. I'll beat this with a drum, but I'll just say right now that all of this is reclaimed land somewhere after the early 20th century. All of this was totally swamped, totally deserted, totally desolate, unlivable, dangerous, malarial swamp up until the Zionist movement began to bring Jewish refugees here, and they were reclaimed thousands of acres of land, and say today it's marvelously fruitful and so on. And we'll travel it. This is the plain of Sharon or Sharon. And here are some of the orchards and the flower groves and so on that they use. This is the Jezreel Valley. Here is the hill of Moreh, and over here the Gilboa and so on. Those were standing on Mount Carmel and looking across and so on. Again, this flat plain out here is what you think of as the Jezreel Valley. Again, this is the same valley. We're looking a little further to the west. In the circle here is Tel Megiddo, so we're on the south, guarding one of those passes. Here is the Mount Tabor. Here's the hill of Moreh again. Matter of fact, this right here is Nazareth, where Jesus was reared. Of course, it's a huge city today. But the point is, we're looking across, and you get a feel for these plains. There again, now we're on Gilboa looking across. And this, by the way, in front of us here, That area is the shaft of the arrow, I keep calling it, the Valley of Harod. So those are the coastal plains, and then you have the Shfela. Now the Shfela is this area of low rolling hills. It's a softer limestone. It is twice important. We'll talk about it. But again, these are those rolling hills that's quite open. Geographers speak of an area as open if means you can put a road most anywhere. As you can figure then, closed means it's hard to put a road. Well, the area of the Judean hills that are just beyond this is very closed, but this area is quite open. That is the area of the Shfela, and here are more of these quite broad valleys. You see, you can actually till those valleys. Again, this huge valley here, and but now look at this. This is important, and there's one more of these. But here are the undulating hills and so on. This area beyond, this area here, these hills right here, that's the Judean hills. They're much, much different, much steeper. Here you see it even better, because here are these undulating, this is an aerial shot. You can see the hills of the Shfela right before us here. And then in the distance, the Greater Brown Hills back in the distance that rise up another 1,000 feet or so, they're the hills of Judea. And this is very steep, and Bethlehem sits probably right up about here. So these are very steep, difficult hills where the Shfela is quite open. Here we are overlooking the Sorek Valley, one of those hills that cuts through. Now, the Central Hill Country. The Central Hill Country, this spine which stretches north to south, hugely, it's difficult terrain. And notice, here are some of the Judean hills. Notice again, very V-shaped valleys, not broad valleys you can till. The hillsides tend to be terraced because this is stratified limestone, and as it was pushed up after the flood, it produces these natural terraces and so on. What does that mean? It's very hard to travel. You can't take a cart down the side of that hill. So all the traffic has to stay up here on the ridges, and the ridges oftentimes don't go anywhere. You got to know the ridges. Here again, these are forested hillsides, but you can see they're very terraced, narrow valleys. Same thing here. All of these, this is the Rephaim Valley just west of Jerusalem. Again, this is why, even though this area gets a good deal of rain, most of the rain goes tumbling down the hillsides and gets caught in these wadis, these dry riverbeds, which when the rains come become torrents and so on. So you can see this is very difficult territory. It's where Jerusalem is. It's where Bethlehem is. It's Shechem and Hebron and Shiloh and so on, all up here in the hill country, Gibeon. But you just need to know it's very difficult territory. This is Tel Samaria, the hill that King Omri bought and moved the capital of the northern kingdom here. Here we are at Shiloh. Now I put this in here. This is Jerusalem. Here's the Temple Mount. That is, you can see the Dome of the Rock, and up here is the Watershed Ridge, and over here is the Mount of Olives. And this is the Valley of Rephaim. The Valley of Kidron. My point is, Jerusalem is just that terrain: steep hills, rugged territory, hard to catch the water, and so on. So that's the hill country, and then beyond the hill country is the Jordan Rift. Again, it's better called let me sure you understand, the Syro-African Rift, because it stretches from Syria up in the north all the way to Central Africa, about 1/6 of the Earth's circumference is girdled by this cleft in the face of the earth, about 1,400 miles. Now, it is just that. It is a gouge in the face of the earth. Where it is the deepest is right here. In America, in USA, the deepest spot, the deepest spot is Death Valley, and it's about 282 feet below sea level. The Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. The Jordan River flows some 60 miles from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea. Is about 60 miles. Jordan River, because it's a little meandering creek almost, but it travels over 100 miles. But it brings us down to the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level on its surface, and it's 1,200 foot deep. Now, the point to be made is that, and this is, in fact, Jericho sits right here at 900 feet below sea level, about here, and it's the lowest city on earth, and the surface of the Dead Sea is the lowest spot on the face of the earth, 1,300 feet below sea level. So I make that point to just say that this is a deep, foreboding, unfriendly, inhospitable, inaccessible cleft. And you don't want to go down there. Now, I give you some pictures here just real quickly. There again is the Jordan Rift. It continues. Now, way up to the north, you see up here is Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon, there are 4 springs that come down off of Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is a real mountain range. It goes up to 9,000 feet, a couple hundred miles north in Lebanon and so on. Mount Hermon in Israel is actually the southern tip of a range of mountain called the Anti-Lebanon Mountains. But the point is that this is the water that feeds the Jordan system, because the water is going to flow down here into the Sea of Galilee. I'm sorry, that's the Hula, Sea of Galilee, and then through the Jordan down here into the Dead Sea. And not all of it. There are tributaries along the way, especially from the east, but they're mostly dammed up today, and the water is drawn off by Jordan. But the point is that there are 4 springs that feed the Jordan system. And so you don't expect it, but way up to the north, you get scenes such as this. This is Tel Dan, and the strongest of those 4 springs is the Dan spring, and we'll visit that. This is Beit Shan. We're walking around Beit Shan here. This is just going to be interesting. But now we've gone all the way down to the south. This is the Jeshimon, the wilderness down by the Jordan. This is across the Dead Sea and so on. Here we are in Jericho in the Dead Sea. Some things that would be fun to talk about. This, of course, is Cave 4 and Qumran, where the scrolls were found. But we'll visit all these. This is En-Gedi. Here's Masada. And this is the wilderness where it's so important. We'll spend a whole day down here. Not my favorite spot, but this the Dead Sea off this way. So the point is, and I like this picture, this really is a good picture. Generally, when we think of the wilderness in the Bible, sometimes we think of a jungle or something. The wilderness is a function of the fact that the Arabian desert is way over here. For 6 months of the year, the wind comes from the east off across it blows across this salt-laden air of the Dead Sea, and it just bakes this side of the Dead Sea. So this area to the west of, in other words, the desert is way over here. The winds are coming this way, and they're baking this area on the west side of the sea. Beyond that is the Jordan, the Transjordanian Plateau. So I'm not going to, we won't visit that. Now, here's the point. And let me make sure you're with me, that little mini geography lesson. I'm taking too long here, but the significance is this. Again, you have the hill country here, you have the little Shphelah down here, you have the coastal plains here, then the Shphelah, then the hill country, then the Jordan Rift, and so on. What's that all about? Well, the fact is that, and let me give you a map, picture here to make this point. Here is, again, basically the international highways, the local trunks of the Fertile Crescent, and you have the one making its way on the east side, which is the King's Highway, and then on the west side, which is the Via Maris, the more important one. But the point is that Israel lives up in this hill country and is remarkably secure. Why? Because the traffic doesn't want to come up here. They're not going to come from the east. If they come up in from the west, they're just going to have to go back down. And so the point is, and this is what I want you to get, everybody who studies Israel makes the point that one of the most remarkable and important and defining and staggering truths about this little tiny land geographically is that it is at once so private and so public. At once so private, so public. Here you have all the internet. I would say it's like living on the median of a modern freeway, because you got the traffic going on both sides, but they could live up here in the hill country in remarkable security and honor God. Because remember that Jerusalem is right here up in the hill country. And so the point is that in God's careful providences and purposes. Even though Israel is this choke point on the international highway and all the traffic of the world is making their way through, and as they do, they're hearing the stories of what God is doing, and they're bearing that to the rest of the world. And in that sense, she is a kingdom with a priestly function. On the other hand, because of the remarkable divisions, she can also, and she was, a remarkably holy nation. Now, when you think of holy, you think of moral holiness. That's not the point here. But on the other hand, she was, in fact, a set-apart nation. She was distinct. I try and make the point here. Here, once again, are the international traffic. Here's the traffic coming down from the north. It might be going down the King's Highway to the east. But either way, this area right here, the hill country, is remarkably private. And that's all in the purposes of God. Now, I got one more. We're going to be very quick. And that is the wisdom and will of God concerning the worship and walk of Israel. You know what I'm talking about here? And it's a word that we almost have some contempt for, the law. Now, understand, and pivotal to this, is this idea, and we will talk about this so much, and if it's new to you, come to grips with it, the theocracy. Theos, God, kratos, rule. And the fact is that from 1446 at Mount Sinai, when God offered them a covenant by which he would be their king and they would be his people, from 1446 until 592, when the glory cloud departs in the days of Ezekiel the prophet, Israel was a theocracy. That is, Yahweh, King Yahweh ruled in Israel. Now that's hugely important, because the fact is that part of what King Yahweh did for Israel was to give them this marvelous law code. And it's the law. But it touched every facet of public and private life, and it shaped the theology and the testimony, and that's my point here, of the nation. The significance is that that law code was intended by God to be the means by which individuals, as they honored the law and so on, whether they were Israelites or Gentile proselytes, could draw near to God, and by which Israel as a nation, remember, they are a kingdom, a nation with a priestly function. So Israel as a kingdom, because they had this law system, no matter how haltingly or carelessly they observed it, nonetheless, that law was there, and it bore testimony to the nation that they were distinct and that their lawgiver was infinitely superior to any human lawgiver. Now, this is celebrated in Deuteronomy 4, where God says, and I think I'll read the whole passage to you, Deuteronomy 4, and of course, this is Moses about to die, and he's there in the plains of Moab, and he's going to preach this final covenant affirmation book to them. But in introducing the book, he rehearses the laws he has already given. And let me just say real quickly that's what the Torah is. Law. It's called the law, the teaching, the Torah, the Pentateuch, but 5 books of Moses, Genesis, no law. Exodus, narrative up to about chapter 20, and then it's pretty much law. And then all of Leviticus, every syllable of it, practically, except for a brief historical narrative in Leviticus 8 and 9 and then 10, just where Aaron is made priest and then his sons are offered the strange fire. And then then the first 10 chapters of Numbers, all law. But then you have history where the glory cloud goes up, Kadesh Barnea, refused to go in, they all die. Moses takes them up to Moab, and then Deuteronomy is virtually all law. So and I'm talking about law. I'm talking about statutes, codes, rules, laws by which they will live, both how their religion is to be conducted, how their priests are to handle themselves and dress, civil laws, what happens if your ox gets loose and rips up your neighbor's garden, who pays for that, moral laws, basically the 10 Commandments and so on. It's law. Think about half of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, about half of it is just law. This is what makes your read it through difficult when you get to Leviticus and you grow weary of contemplating the fat under the tail of the ram. So it may be a little hard on us, but understand this. There is nothing that more thoroughly, and this is a foreboding thought with regard to our own nation and time, there is nothing which more thoroughly defines and demonstrates the moral character of a people as a people than the laws that they make and enforce, what they will tolerate, what they will demand, and what they'll not tolerate. Well, Moses says in Deuteronomy chapter 4, he says to his people concerning his statutes, he says, verse 5, surely, this is Moses speaking, I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should act according to them in the land which you go to possess. Now listen to this. Therefore, be careful to observe them. For this, what? The laws. This is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes. They seem a little bit laborious and heavy to us, and we with Paul rejoice over the fact we're no longer under the law. But that's not to say that there was anything ignoble or demeaning about the law. The law was infinitely wise and noble, and so he says, they will hear, the nations will hear these marvelous laws. Be careful to observe them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes, and they'll say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has God so near to it? Now, this is Moses speaking. He says to the people, what nation is there that has a God so near to it as Yahweh, our God, is to us, for whatever reason we may call upon him? And what great nation is there? Hear this. What great nation is there that has such statutes and righteous judgments as in all this law which I set before you this day? So the point is that one of the most powerful means by which Israel as a nation was going to represent the God who had called them to himself is this system of laws which they would honor. This would be your wisdom and your understanding. You will be regarded as a wise and understanding people because of the laws. Now, I'm out of time and then some, but I'll just mention that I'll say it again. We tend to have a rather intuitive, knee-jerkish contempt for the law because we've been delivered from it by the grace of God through the death of Christ. Amen and amen. But that's not to say, remember what we have, Hebrews doesn't say that what we have is good because what went before was awful. Paul says in one breath, the law is good. The law is marvelously, my good sums up everything that God is. It's the most important word in the Bible, to gather up all the attributes of God. And Paul says the law is good. What we have is better, Hebrews says. But that doesn't mean that what they had was somehow ignoble or to be regarded with contempt. And the way widows were handled, no other nation on earth cared for its widows. The Bible, the law of Moses made it explicit that if a man married a woman and then died before he gave her seed, the family, the brothers were responsible to come and raise up seed to her so that she wouldn't be rejected and thrown out of the clan. Jurisprudence, civil law, determining guilt and innocence or innocence in a criminal case, caring for the poor, just in every conceivable way. The law which God gave and by which Israel was to abide, and she never did it carefully. But there it was, screaming at the world, and the world was duly impressed by it. That was a means. The law was one of the most important means. Listen, study the law, spend time with it, understand its intricacies and its concepts. It is such a marvelous, marvelous expression of what a just and moral and equitable and passionate and merciful people would look like if you honored that. Everybody is all acknowledged. Some of the greatest apostates in recent history have studied the law and acknowledged if any people ever lived by this, it would be the most equitable and delightful and peaceful nation that ever lived. So we bring it together longer than it should have been. But let me just review. Here they are. First of all, let's just review them. The intent and importance of Israel's influence. Why does God, after 1900 years or so of human history, Genesis 1 to 11, creation, flood, fall, Babel, why does God change his tactics? Why does he make us go around such a huge corner and call one man to himself? Well, it was in order God had raised up the most important and effective object lesson in all of human history, and it is Abraham and his people. But in order that they would have that influence, that they would be that kingdom with a priestly function, he shaped the earth in such a way that the little tiny land of Israel was positioned precisely where all the caravans, especially, but the military traffic of the world would be funneled in there. They would hear these stories, they would bear it to the rest of the world, and thus they would become they would serve as a kingdom, a people there in the land, regardless of how many of them were twice born, that had a priestly influence. God was mediating the truth of himself to the world through them. But in order for that to be, they had to be a holy nation, and therefore you have these remarkably distinctive divisions, the little land, distinctive divisions, traffic out here in the highways, but right in the center is this hill country where Israel lives up in Jerusalem, and to whatever halting degree is able to honor her God and so on. So Israel is at once public with those highways, private with those hills and so on, and thus she becomes a holy nation. But in order to demonstrate, or the element of her holiness, which was perhaps most importantly put on display, not necessarily most importantly, but most dramatically, most inescapably put on display, was the marvelous quality and character, the majestic, magisterial nobility of the law. That is God's wisdom and will concerning how they were to worship and how they were to walk. So, that's lecture 1. I want you to get these things. We'll talk about them again and again while we're in Israel. I'll even rehearse them rather briefly, because I think again, I'm going to stop where I started, and that is to say that we encounter this culture shock. So we need to recalibrate our heads. When we are thinking about what God is doing in the Old Testament, we have to deliberately, intentionally think in terms of what the Bible, that scriptures explicitly say God was doing, and avoid the temptation or the tendency, better, to just extrapolate what we know today and think that, well, Israel was pretty much in the Old Testament doing what the local church, that's where I would go, says is today. It's not true. Now, as to God's purposes, yes. God's purposes was A, to glorify himself, and to that end, B, if you don't mind, to put himself on display to the world. And he did that through the little nation of Israel. That was God's intent. He shaped the world to make it happen, and then he shaped the little land of Israel so that they could be a holy people, and then he gave them this remarkable law system. That's the first 4 of 7 concepts, and we will go to the other 3 more quickly in the next lecture.